WWF Wrestlemania, the arcade game for the Sega Genesis 32X. That awkward contraption that Sega made for Genesis owners who couldn't afford a Sega Saturn and nobody bought anyway. That may or may not be a slight exaggeration, but anyway, this is an adaptation of the 1994 WrestleMania arcade game from Midway, where you could choose from one of 8 of the top WWF superstars of the time, depicted in digitized sprites, much in the same vein as Mortal Kombat, in a game that played less like a proper wrestling game and more like a fighting game of sorts, where characters had some wacky moves alongside some of their more traditional wrestling holds that you pull off with specific joystick button combinations. Also, much like in a fighting game, your main goal is to beat up your opponent until he's out of health, and matches are contested in a best of 3 falls match. After picking a wrestler, you can choose to challenge for either the Intercontinental Championship or the World Wrestling Federation Championship. The 2 paths determines the type of opposition you'll be facing. For example, the Intercontinental title run will throw 4 one-on-one matches on you, but then we'll heat things up with a couple 2-on-1 handicap matches, and the title bout itself is contested in a 3-on-1 handicap match. And by the way, you have to beat all members of the opposing team to win the match. On the flip side, the WWF Championship run nets you 4 2-on-1 handicap matches, 2 3-on-1 matches, and the final match is the WrestleMania Challenge, where you have to face off and defeat all 8 wrestlers in a Royal Rumble-esque format in a single round. WrestleMania the arcade game has seen ports onto other consoles, Super Nintendo, PlayStation, MS-DOS, and yes, even the Sega Genesis, all of which we've covered in the past many moons ago, and this Sega 32X iteration of WrestleMania the arcade game could easily be written off as a slight upgrade to the Genesis version, and I suppose you wouldn't be totally wrong in that regard. I'll say this right off the bat, however. If you'd like WrestleMania the arcade game and you have a 32X, by all means give this version a shot if you could find it, because it's a great port. But if you don't have a 32X, you're not really missing out on much, and you're just better off playing the MS-DOS or PlayStation versions, or stick with the arcade original via emulation or something. Avoid the 16-bit versions. Genesis version is slightly playable but not ideal, and the less said about the Super Nintendo port, the better. Trust me, it's not good. Now, in regards to this 32X port, for the most part, most of the game has been retained from the arcade game. You have all 8 WWF superstars to choose from, all the moves have been retained, the action is fast and furious. Just in terms of the gameplay and compared to what you got on the 16-bit side of things, this is pretty much old hat, and if you've played those versions, you'll be able to jump onto this rather easily and be amazed by the somewhat stark improvement in performance, which we'll touch on in a little bit. It's a perfectly playable version of WrestleMania with tight responsive controls to go along with decently paced gameplay. The one step up from the 16-bit version to this 32X port is that the game doesn't suffer from slowdown during those handicap matches, which were a bit of an issue on the 16-bit versions, especially on the Super Nintendo side, but not so much here. As a bit of a trade-off, however, the frame rate is a bit on the choppy side. Not enough to completely wreck the game or anything, but just enough to be noticeable. On the Genesis, the overall graphics are of a lesser quality, but the frame rate was a lot smoother. One thing I tend to notice in playing these 32X games, and I'm basing this just on the game selection I've played thus far, is that the frame rate tends to be an issue with some of these things. Some games play better than others despite that, and WrestleMania certainly fits in that mold as opposed to the latter. Much like all home versions, the 32X version of WrestleMania the arcade game is also missing the character-specific endings of the arcade original, which I thought was always a bit of a shame because those made the game worth playing through the WWF Championship path just to see what became of these 8 men and the widely imaginative outcomes as a result of winning the championship. For example, Shawn Michaels would turn to politics for the money and the women, Razor Ramon would end up owning a pawn shop in Chile, Bam Bam Bigelow becomes an arsonist and burns down the whole arena after winning the title. As for Yokozuna, well...
With conquest comes honor for Yokozuna. He has accomplished his mission to defeat the greatest of the world's wrestlers. tend to professionalism style of wrestling is superior to all others. By stripping the United States of its championship belt and its dignity, Yokozuna enrolled the Reverend is one of his country's greatest champions. The consequences of this victory will no doubt be the undoing of American culture as we know it. There will be years of adversity. American productivity will disintegrate. Industries will collapse. The people will wallow in endless depravity, mere shadows of their former selves. Oh, well, it was bound to happen eventually anyway.
Right you are, Midway. Right you are. Hey, some of these endings might be out of whack, but I'll take these over what happened to these guys in real life in which half the roster's deceased. And now I'm depressed. Thanks. The 32X version of WrestleMania does contain other notable improvements over its Genesis sibling, most in terms of the visual quality. With a higher color count, the mugshots on the title screens are a little more higher quality, the sprites are a little larger compared to the Genesis version, and there's generally less graininess in some of the heads-up displays and such. Most importantly, however, as mentioned before, is that performance is consistent across the board, even when there's 4 guys in the ring, where in the Genesis version would chug a bit when there's 4 people in there. Like I said as well, the only downside as a result is that the frame rate took a noticeable dip, animating slightly less smoothly compared to the Genesis version. Sound has also seen some improvement over its Genesis counterpart. Not so much in the music department because that's still somewhat the same type of music, and it's not much better here, but the sound effects and the voice clips are much clearer, and while there isn't much of the vocal bits, commentary bits from Vince McMahon and Jerry the King Lawler, who were doing commentary at the time, along with the occasional wrestler line drops were a common thing in the arcade game, what's been retained here sounds pretty good at least. Take that for what it's worth. Overall, WWF Wrestlemania, the arcade game for Sega 32X, is a substantial improvement over the Genesis version in terms of overall performance and visual quality, but is it really enough of an upgrade to justify its existence? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. I don't think a slightly better looking and better running WrestleMania arcade port is enough of a selling point to get a 32X, but I do think it's a pretty good reliable conversion despite the less than stellar frame rate, which hurts the overall package a bit but doesn't quite kill it. Otherwise, WrestleMania the arcade game's a nice little wrestling fighting hybrid type of game that's good for a lark and makes for a nice addition to the somewhat limited 32X library.